Welcome to the Salon podcast. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. Today's guest is Dr. Bruce Hood. Bruce is the director of the Bristol Cognitive Development Center in the Experimental Psychology Department at the University of Bristol. He undertook his PhD at Cambridge University, followed by appointments at University College London, MIT, and Harvard. He's been awarded an Alfred Sloan Fellowship in Neuroscience, the Young Investigator Award from the International Society of Infancy Researchers, and the Robert Franz Memorial Award and 2014 Award for Media and Public Engagement by the British Psychological Society. He did the Christmas lectures in England, which is very prestigious. Richard Dawkins did those. He's written several books, all of which I've read and enjoyed. The Domesticated Brain, The Self-Illusion, Why There Is No You Inside Your Head. So as I pointed out, it's a great illusion to have. He's a co-author of a popular introductory psychology book called Psychology with Dan Schachter and Dan Gilbert and Dan Wagner, the three Dans. His book, Super Sense, Why We Believe the Unbelievable, was my first intersection with Bruce, given that he deals with supernatural and superstition, overlapping interests there that we have. And he's done a lot on that, particularly Essentialism, how we impugn essence into physical objects, which leads to his latest book that we talk about here today called Possessed, Why We Want More Than We Need. This will be out from Penguin Books here in the United States and in England. So we discuss quite a few different topics that seem unrelated, but in fact they are. Who owns your body? And your mind, your ideas, your organs, why prostitution is illegal, why you can't sell organs, why slavery is illegal, the long history of marriage and how men essentially owned women and how that's changed. Who owns the land? Who owns air? Who owns the water, minerals? These all have to be hashed out by lawyers and rights and so forth. We talk about the Led Zeppelin lawsuit, where this band Spirit says Led Zeppelin ripped them off in their guitar riff for the opening of Stairway to Heaven. So who owns these notes of music and intellectual property? We talk about wills and trusts and how evolutionary psychology explains a lot of that, kin selection theory in particular, why parents and grandparents are more likely to leave more of their money and property to their genetic kin and kind. The nature of art, who owns art, particularly art forgeries. Why are the forgeries that are indistinguishable from the real ones, so-called real forms of art, which gets to this idea of ownership and property. There's an essence to that. We talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and why essentially you have two guys with the same deed of land granted by God himself, which is a non-falsifiable idea, and why, therefore, that kind of ownership is so destructive. We talk about income inequality, how much money is too much money for somebody to make. Also, the psychology of chasing possessions and why it doesn't always lead to happier lives. And finding that balance. We talk about jealousy as a form of possession, xenophobia as a fear of loss of ownership. And so as you can tell, it was really a wide-ranging, interesting conversation. He's a super interesting guy, one of these psychologists that bounces around to really important and interesting topics that pretty much everybody's interested in. So with that, I'm going to give you Bruce Hood. But first, let me mention, if you appreciate the podcast and the work we do at Skeptic Society and Skeptic Magazine, please do show your support at skeptic.com/donate. Or you can also find us on Patreon and make monthly donations, or you can contact our office. You can get the address and phone number at skeptic.com, where I'm also readily reachable. And so we do appreciate your support. We need your support. We are a 501c3 nonprofit. So with that, thank you for listening. It's good to see you again. Congratulations on the new book, Possessed. I have the British printout here. We'll check when it comes out in America and time the release of this podcast with your pub date here. But I don't think I've seen you since 2009. I was thinking the last time we were together was it was on the bicentennial of Darwin's birth and the 150th anniversary of the origin of species. I was in Bristol giving some lectures on
Yeah.
Darwin. And I'll never forget this. We were crossing a bridge in Bristol, and you stopped, took a picture, and tweeted it out. And I thought, what the hell is a tweet? And who the fuck cares what we're doing on a bridge? And now I tweet the dumbest stuff every day. Like, here I am out on a bike ride listening to an audiobook, and like anybody cares.
Yeah. No, I think we ran into each other at TAM a few times, which is
that's right.
longer, of course. Yeah, no, it's great to see you again.
Yeah, you were an early adopter of Twitter.
I was, yes. Look what that became. It's become this monster. The primary political communication channel for your president.
I know. It's unbelievable. Well, I mean, talk about possessions. I mean, in a way, we're possessed with social media now. That was new in the last decade or so.
Yeah, it's been an incredible 10 years. So much has changed. And I don't think anyone would have predicted the situation we find ourselves in today.
No, totally unpredictable. So, I mean, you have one of the more interesting careers as cognitive scientists go. I've of course, intersected with your first book, Super Sense, because we overlapped in our interest in superstition and supernatural thinking and so on. But then you went on to write about the illusion of the self. There's no self in the brain. I think that's held up pretty well. I think most cognitive scientists and philosophers agree. That it's an illusion, but as illusions go, it's one of the best.
Well, it doesn't mean it's not there. It just means you can't see through it. That's the problem. It's not what it seems.
Right. And the domesticated brain, you talked about, if I recall, that was the long-term self-domestication of humans over evolutionary time.
Yeah.
We became more like bonobos than chimps. or something in between there.
Something in between.
Yeah. So possessed. Again, you and my friends Roy Baumeister, Steven Pinker come up with the most interesting topics for a psychologist to study. I mean, most of everything I've read about property and the possession of it is economically based. So you bring a cognitive psychology perspective to it, which I really appreciate. It was a great read. So let's just get right into it. I mean, we think of most of us think intuitively of what I own. Well, my primary property is my body. It's myself. I own my body. But then I was thinking about that. I was reading your book. I graduated from high school in 1972. I missed the Vietnam draft by 1 year, and had but for the grace of God or whoever, the U.S. government could have said, "We now own your body. You have to go to Vietnam, and you have no choice unless I ran off to Canada," which was illegal. So I mean, legally, they could have me killed in the name of a national interest. So who owns my body?
Yeah, and even in peacetime, I talk about this. We naturally just assume that that's the one thing we can be certain that we own because we walk around with it, we are it, we live it every day. But actually, there's some incredibly interesting oddities of people contesting ownership of bodies. And in the book, I point to that remarkable case of the guy who finds somebody's foot in a junk sale, and then the owner of the foot from which it's come challenges for it, and they have this legal battle about who owns the foot, which I think is quite remarkable.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Body parts. Mary Roach has a book about this, the science writer Mary Roach, on what happens to body parts after bodies die, who owns them, to what extent the family has any control over that.
Yeah.
Which gets to suicide, assisted suicide, euthanasia. I mean, again, the government is, until recently has basically said, you can't kill yourself. What do you mean I can't kill myself? Because you can't. We own your body in a way.
Well, in ancient Rome, of course, suicide was a very noble form of exiting the world. It's what the noble people did. But unless you were a soldier or a slave, suicide was illegal because you were considered property. In fact, it was punishable by death, which is ironic. So,
right.
You weren't allowed to do it.
Right. Yeah. It's like these prisoners on death row that try to kill themselves, and state goes to great measure to keep them alive until it's time to execute them. So I guess that's based on the long rule of law, but basically, again, it's the state is saying, as a citizen, we own you to a certain extent, or own your actions.
Yeah, and even then, there's conflicts. I mean, we had some recent cases at Alderhay, which is a hospital in Merseyside, and a child was basically terminally ill, and the doctors wanted to turn off the life support system, and the parents obviously objected to this, and they took it to the High Court, and this became a real legal issue of who owns the child. And most parents assume that they are the owners of their children. And we talk about, we use that sort of language, but actually from a legal point of view, that's not entirely true.
Yeah, that's right. In America, with like Christian Scientists who don't believe in doctors and medicine, for the most part, that's not a big deal. But occasionally the state will step in if the child is about to die and the parents refuse medical care that would keep them alive. Then they step in, and social services comes in, and child protection agencies step in, and basically they say, we now own the child, at least temporarily.
Yeah. I mean, we're responsible for our children, and we're accountable for our children. One of the things that in researching the book that I didn't know is actually that children are accountable for their parents. So when they get to a stage of when they're going to nursing homes, for example, the children are actually obliged. There's a little known law called the Final Support Law, so that they can be sued for the costs of looking after the parent in elderly homes. So it works both ways.
That's crazy. Well, we like to think of it, I guess, socially, that our parents took care of us when we were little. So, when you get to be around our age and have aging parents, we kind of owe it to them to take care of them. And yet more and more the state has kind of taken over many of those duties. And as you know, and I'm sure this is the case in England, there's much debate about to what extent the state should spend money on welfare, Social Security, healthcare, because 90% of healthcare costs are absorbed in the last final year or two of life.
That's right.
So who's paying for that?
Sorry, Michael. But and then you've got the demographic time bomb, which is basically you've got an increasing age, so an increasing population of elderly people, and a reduction in the number of young children, people who can produce the taxation and the salaries and the wages to pay for that. So it's a real concern for most economies, especially in the West, with dwindling populations.
Yeah, and in Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now, he's got that section on social spending as a percent of GDP. And pretty much every Western democracy, all 20 of them or so, are around 20%. About a fifth of their total GDP per year is spent on social spending, which of all kinds, Social Security, welfare, healthcare, Medicaid, Medicare, and so forth, which includes this, taking care of people in their older age. Yes. And then, so then we have organ donations. Why can't I donate an organ if I want, or sell it? It's mine.
Yeah. Well, you can in Australia or Singapore, but not in the US or the UK.
Why not?
Exactly. Well, because it comes down to the basic point that ownership is a concept, and therefore there's nothing written in nature to define who owns what, and that's why we have lawyers. Because if you think about it, you can always extrapolate back in time who had something before you, and so on and so forth. When did it become a product? When did it become an item? And, you can draw a long causal chain between taking something out of nature and then deciding who sells what, and did they have the rights of access to the natural resource, and so on and so forth. And of course, now we're seeing the consequences of this. Indigenous people are asking for their land back. You say, hold a second, you stole it. You took it. You didn't sell it for $24. I still own Manhattan, for heaven's sake. So, so you can see how, if you go back far enough, you can get into this problem, which is, again, why lawyers have great jobs. They're disputing ownership. Intellectual property is another wonderful thing. One of the most valuable it's not a commodity. One of the most valuable resources you can have is information. Well, who owns that information? Every time we sign on to an app, we're ticking a little box, which is basically allowing the companies to harvest that data. And so we're getting to some very difficult territories about, who owns the data, who owns an idea. I mean, what is an original idea? It's almost impossible to conceive of one. So clearly everything has a long trail or precedence. And again, this is what lawyers do. They argue about whether or not someone has a rightful claim, whether, is there a priori situation. So these are the sorts of things that I draw out in the book. The idea is a concept, and as such, it's a concept that we have to learn as children. So I'm really interested as a psychologist, what do children have an intuitive sense of, and what do they have to be told by culture? And if you remember back in the first book, we were talking about supernatural beliefs, and I argued that it wasn't all indoctrination, that rather children spontaneously come up with kind of belief systems which may be the way their brains reason, but culture can then shape that. I think that's true of ownership. I think that children have a kind of intuitive sense of possession, and they will fight from a very early age over things. But then they have to be socialized, and they're told what is appropriate ownership and who owns what and what you can do. And when you start to look at it, you realize that actually ownership controls our lives in such powerful ways that we're not often explicitly aware of.
Yeah, I now have a 3-year-old.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah. I have a 27-year-old daughter, and now I have a 3-year-old son, and so it's kind of fun to revisit that whole concept of property, because we take them to this little playground where all kids play. It's an indoor structure, and pretty much whatever you have in your arms, that's mine. Yeah. And most of the kids, they want whatever the other kid has, and
exactly.
if he looks away and they can nab it, then that's mine. I mean, you really see the sense of ownership of stuff pretty early. And the most commonly spoken word in this facility has to be sharing. Come on, sharing.
Or mine. Mine is the other one.
Oh, is that what they say in England? Mine?
Yeah, mine.
Oh, mine, yes. Oh, right. Yeah, exactly.
It's not uncommon for kids. I mean, over 90% of conflicts in the playgrounds are over possession of toys. Mm-hmm. And it's not uncommon for a child to kind of fight with another toddler for a toy. But once they've got it, they abandon it and go after another child's toy.
Right.
So it's not the accumulation of things that they appreciate. They realize that this is how you establish status, is by what you can claim control and ownership over. So they understand from a very early age the kind of the relationship between ownership and power.
Now, what do you mean status?
Status is where they are in the pecking order. So the most dominant children will try to accumulate the possessions of others, and that's how they accumulate more status.
Oh, I see. Power. It's related to power, not having the actual stuff. The stuff doesn't matter so much.
No, not really. No, they just want to exercise their dominance.
Right. So, we can get into the kind of evolutionary origins of the sense of ownership. You envision hunter-gatherers don't have much stuff because they move around a lot and there isn't much wealth to accumulate anyway, but they have some sense of privacy, and this is my little, this is my stone tool or whatever. But there's a lot of enforced sharing of, say, food products and other items.
That's right. And they have a concept called demand sharing, which is if you're not using it, then I'm entitled to help myself to it. So it's a very efficient way of just making sure that you keep down the number of resources, as you say, to be mobile, but getting utilitarian value out of things which are not in use. Whereas it'd be really strange if you went over to your neighbor's house and just took their kettle and said, well, you weren't using it, I just need it. I need it. So this is one of the peculiarities. And there are not that many hunter-gatherers left, to be honest. There's only one tribe in Tanzania, really, I think, could be regarded as still relatively hunter-gathering. But you're right. It's not entirely as if they don't have any personal possessions, but relative to a typical kind of middle-class family, then obviously not very much.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in terms of like income inequality, when I was writing about this for one of my books, it was like they don't have much income inequality because they don't have much income. I mean, they're just everybody is super poor. You can't accumulate stuff because there's nothing to accumulate. I mean, most property in the modern world is created. It's not discovered in the ground. It's just something we create. I mean, aluminum has next to no value when it's just in the dirt, but it has to be developed into a product. So that gets us, I mean, that's like sort of the labor theory of value in economics. To what extent is its value depending on my labor or your labor, or if the capitalist who puts up the investment to then create the labor, then that gets us down in that rabbit hole of economics. But again, who owns the land, air, water, minerals, et cetera? There, it's back to your lawyers basically say, well, okay, we're just going to have mining rights for this particular state or this particular mine, and you get it for the next 50 years or something like that. You're not really discovering something in nature. It's just, we're just going to agree.
Yeah. So I talk about Banksy, who I'm very proud of, who comes from Bristol, and he's this famous artist. Your listeners not aware, but he's become infamous, if you like, for poking the eye of the establishment over the issues of ownership, because he does all this incredible art, which is now very valuable, but he never claims ownership over it, and he basically lets people fight it out in the courts of law. Who actually owns anything? Is it the person that owns the wall? Does it belong to the city? And there's one remarkable case where it was on a demolition site. He painted this murals, and the workmen didn't know what it was. But when word got out to the local art gallery, they rushed down there with a pickup truck, and they just, they carefully removed the wall, because if they had done nothing, the workmen would have bulldozed it and not known what they had done. But when the landowners heard of this, they took them to court, said, "You've just stolen our property." But you can see, actually, without the intervention of the art gallery, the property would have been destroyed anyway. So again, this raises the issue, well, what is the labor? What's the original intent? What's the intellectual property? What's the effort? And so on. There's no simple solution here, and that's why we have these disputes.
Who was that artist last year that had his own painting self-destruct right
that's
after?
Banks.
Oh, that's
Banksy.
That's him. Okay, right. That was wild.
That was crazy. Yeah. He quoted Picasso. He said that destruction is construction or an art of creation.
Right.
I suspect that actually he was both the buyer and the destroyer of the picture. So I think it was a stunt.
Oh, is that right? He was the anonymous. I see.
Explanation, because that's a pretty contrived picture frame to get into the Sotheby's gallery. So I suspect they were in on it as well.
Oh, I see.
So,
okay.
But that's okay. That's what he does. He gets you to think about things.
So that's performance art.
That's performance, yeah. But yeah, he's great because he challenges he challenges our conventions about consumerism, ownership, capitalism. He's a kind of provocateur, and I value that, because I think we need these people to kind of keep reminding us that we get carried away sometimes and often don't challenge or think about what motivates us.
Have you followed this legal case of Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven? There's a lawsuit by there's a band called Spirit is the name of the band. Taurus was their not so famous song, in which the guitar it opens with this dun 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 dun, and sounds very similar to the opening riff of Stairway to Heaven. And now, the original guitarist, he's long dead, and so the family is suing Led Zeppelin, saying you ripped off this guitar riff and turned it into the greatest rock song of all time, and they've made $1 gazillion and so on. They want their share. And it went to trial, and Led Zeppelin won. But on appeal now, I think the family gets another trial. And it's like, but it's just like, like 8 bars. That's it. It's like, who owns that? And I mean, there's only so many variations of notes.
Hey, tell me, if you play it backwards, does it talk about
That's right. It's right. It's just see your lawyer. Intellectual property. I mean, it's getting to be a complicated issue for these kinds of things, where there's only so many original thoughts, and particularly with music, it's just sort of arranging notes in a way, or words on a page for authors. The gray areas and the similarities, and who decides? Well, often it comes down to lawyers arguing in court.
Yeah, I think the explosion of the digital era has really got us to think about a whole manner of questions about materialism, our relationship with physical things. I also cover in the book my interest, as you well know, about essentialism, the way that certain items are deemed to be irreplaceable because of some invisible property that we think they contain, and this really affects our valuation of it. So the classic example is if you have a masterpiece and then you present an identical reproduction that you can't tell the difference. Why is one worth more than the other? And clearly, at one level, they're exactly the same, but in a deep psychological level, one has this authenticity, which evokes all sorts of psychological essentialism. There's some invisible property. So I talk a little bit about that as well. And I also think that's interesting. It explains why, for example, books, everyone assumed that the digital book would be the death of the conventional book, but actually we're now seeing the rise of books again. So people have this intimate relationship with certain possessions, and some things are not easily replaced by the digital format. So I think that speaks to something about our psychology of needing physical substantiations of things that we value.
Yeah, one of my best friends, Nick, he's a chef and one of my cycling buddies. He's really into vinyl records. I mean, he has thousands. And he's got the old turntable, and he's got all the amplifiers and all the proper cables and so on. And he swears it's better than digital. And I can't tell the difference because I'm not an aficionado. But there's when you go into his house, there's also this sense of the stuff is really cool. You pull you pull the vinyl album out, you pull it out of the sleeve, and you hold it on the edge not to scratch it. You set it down, and you clean it with this little cloth, and it's so much more than just the notes. It's just the music.
Don't tell me he's got them all catalogued in alphabetical order and has them cross-catalogued as well by any chance?
Probably, yeah.
So my good friend George Newman at Yale, he did a study of collectors of the Beatles' White Album.
Oh. And
it turns out that they all have codes on them, to tell you when they were pressed.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
And the closer the number is to zero, the more valuable the copy is. So there's, again, this kind of notion that you're getting closer to the Beatles, the smaller the number. And indeed, UK pressings are more valuable than US pressings.
Oh, my God.
It's just like Levi jeans. If they're made in San Francisco, they're worth more than if they're made in Milwaukee.
Is that right?
Yeah. So there's all this evidence that essentialism underpins commercial value. The closer it is to the source of origin, the more valuable or authentic that people think it is.
Yeah, there was that German.
I was trying to remember. So this each White Album has a serial number on it, and that ranges up into the hundreds of thousands. But the lower the number is, the more valuable the record
is. That printed on the album itself or on the cover?
Yeah, it's on the inside. I think it's on the inside of actually onto the vinyl. I think.
Oh, wow! Right. Yes, because the music it's all the same, exact same recording. But yeah, all right. Yeah, there is a sense that I guess if you have a Picasso, Rembrandt ripoff, that you can't tell the difference. But there's still a sense that, well, that dab of paint right there, he put that dab of paint there, as opposed to some, fraudulent artist centuries later.
Yeah. So one of the criticisms about essentialism I've often encountered, people say, well, you're talking as if there's some sort of property in it. Surely the reason people feel reverence is because of the association. So this thing about memorabilia versus murderabilia. I used to do a stunt. In fact, this is how I ended up doing my first book, where I'd hold up a cardigan, sweater.
Yes.
And I say, would you wear this? And the audience would go, yeah, why not? And I say, well, would you do it for $20? And then all the hands go up, and they said, would you still put the cardigan on if you knew it belonged to Jeffrey Dahmer?
Right.
I use Fred West in the UK, but Jeffrey Dahmer's your equivalent there. And then all the hands come down. They think, oh my God, I feel like I could get contaminated. And I said, well, that's essentialism. But critics said, well, no, that could just be pure association, because when you hear the name Dahmer, you associate, and that triggers that. But then I said, well, look, imagine another scenario. Imagine you've got two cookery books. Imagine you've got two books. One book is a cookery book telling you how to make apple strudel. And the other book is a biography of Adolf Hitler. Which book would you be happy to hold? This is, well, I don't have a problem. Until you tell them that the cookery book belonged to Adolf Hitler. Now, there's more facts and associated information in the biography, but the cookery book, because of its presumed physical contact with the evil mass murderer, is the one which triggers the repugnance. So it's not association. It's literally you believe there is something that you could be contaminated by.
That would also seem to be supported by, I think it was your experiment with putting Brad Pitt's shirt up for sale on eBay. Yeah.
Oh, that's actually Paul Bloom, a good colleague.
Oh, Paul Bloom did that. That's right. That's right. Yeah. Well, that's just you want that pure essence of Bradness, that pure sexual sweat or whatever.
Or the George Clooney ones. He calls them Clooney cooties.
Oh, I didn't know. He did the same thing with George. This is George Clooney's sweatshirt or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's crazy. Well, but there is a sense of physical stuff. I just got back from Freedom Fest, which is this big libertarian conference in Las Vegas every year, where I speak. But instead of booking me through my lecture agency and then I get paid, weeks or months later through a wire transfer, my friend Mark Skousen there, he gives me gold coins. He pays me in gold coins. Yeah.
Is that really a gold coin?
Oh yeah, that's a 1 ounce eagle gold coin. Yeah, you can see it there.
I am impressed.
Yeah.
I want to touch this. I'm touching the screen.
I know. And so, I mean, I have a bunch of these over the years, and I don't want to sell them. I mean, I should just go cash them in and then put it in my bank account and whatever. But there's something about touching a gold coin. It feels, it doesn't feel like money. In the same sense that, modern banking, I never see any money. It's just binary digits in my account. They go in, they go out, they go in, they go out. And I hope I have more at the end of the month. But with a gold coin, it just feels, I don't know if you'd call that essentialism, but it's something like a physical object.
Yeah, well, there are studies showing that touching money does change you psychologically. And there's obviously gold, the Midas touch, is something. There's been a very long and peculiar relationship with gold that we've had it's a very attractive metal. It can be, it can be fashioned, but it didn't really have any value other than the fact it was rare, and therefore it was a proxy for a resource until fairly recently, when they discovered its electromagnetic property, all the valuable properties of gold. So a little bit like other raw materials. It's when they become processed, then they take on a utilitarian value. But gold and its rarity, of course, has long been associated as a treasure. So hence this. The gold, the madness of the 49ers and the kind of craziness of what gold does to the human mind is kind of interesting.
Yeah, which is similar to what all possessions do. I'm fortunate that I don't have very many expensive hobbies. One of them is sunglasses. I like to buy Oakley sunglasses, and only Oakley's, because when I was a bike racer, Oakley was one of my first corporate sponsors, and they had just started. But they became a very successful company, and they have cool designs and so on. Now, when I first get a pair, I'm really super careful. I put it in the cloth bag, and I'm very careful. But after a few weeks, inevitably, I drop it, and they get scratched. This one I got maybe a month ago. It already has scratches on it. And the moment it gets kind of scratched up, it's just like, oh, fuck it. And I just kind of throw them around. And for maybe 6 months, I wear them, and I don't really care. I lose the valued touch of it once it's scratched up, and I'm actually kind of relieved. Because the time I spent being super careful not to scratch it is a little anxiety producing. And the moment I give up, like, I don't care, then it's actually kind of a relieving thing about owning that.
So I don't know if you know that. I think it might be Dan O'Reilly, but he's done that great study with the Gucci sunglasses. And he did this study where he gave people to wear sunglasses, and he told them they were counterfeit Gucci. In fact, they were real Gucci. I think they were Gucci. But the point is that when people put on what they believe to be counterfeit glasses, they felt sordid. So yes, everyone wants to signal their kind of prowess by wearing branded things. But if they're aware that it's a counterfeit, they can also feel a little bit sort of, less than subtle. Oh,
you have that discussion in the book about one of the brand name purse manufacturers, where the logo used to be large, but then they got ripped off too easily, so they made the logo smaller.
Yeah, Louis Vuitton.
That's it.
Yeah, so now there's a new trend in the super rich or the very wealthy to go for quality items where the branding is inconspicuous. Well, you can't really see it, and only if you're aware of the kind of that whole brand, you would notice that was a quality item. And for example, Burberry suffered because part of their they have a particular check pattern. That became almost a uniform for a subculture in the UK who are known as the Chads, who are into kind of football, and they're just not what you would regard as the Burberry type of buyer. And so they saw their value of their products dropping significantly because of this association. So brands send out signals, and that's their value. But if that signal is adopted by a particular group that you don't want to promote your brand, then it can lose its value. So it's kind of interesting, the whole kind of, and that of course comes from evolutionary theory and costly signaling and signaling theories. That one of the reasons we accumulate things is because we want to tell people something about ourselves. In particular, we want to sort of broadcast our status. And what's really interesting is that need to establish status seems to be amplified in those individuals who come from lower social classes, because there's so much more competition. Once you've kind of made it, you don't have to do it so much. So it's really a reflection of where you are, again, in the pecking order. If there's a lot of competition in your neighborhood, that's why you see a lot of the bling culture. not necessarily because it's anything to do with race. It's to do with what's the competition.
Now, if you're at the very top, you don't need to signal anything. So you had that story about the actress at the Oscars or Golden Globes wearing tennis shoes. I forget who it was.
That's right. Yeah, Sybil Shepherd.
Sybil Shepherd, right? Because she doesn't have to. She has nothing to prove.
Yeah, and she was counter signaling. So she was saying, look, I don't need to dress. I am so good, Whereas if you were a more junior actress, if you did that, that would be considered, inappropriate. So, and again, Mark Zuckerberg and the whole Silicon Valley thing about, the sneakers and the hoodies and all that thing is sort of saying, we don't have to dress up like corporates. And again, it's sending out signals and messages about confidence and status.
Yeah, I remember I met the Google boys at this conference back in, I think it was 99. I think they had just gone IPO or they were about to go IPO. And this was a conference for advanced high school kids, all right? So, and they were in jeans and T-shirts and tennis shoes. And I thought, this is super cool. This is like the new corporate America. But maybe it's the corporate America just for Silicon Valley, maybe not New York or something. Or maybe banking would be a different industry than, say, computers.
Yeah. Well, Francesca Gino is at the Harvard Business School. She's done a lot of work in this branding, and she talks to corporates. And it's kind of interesting that your status almost goes up if you're seen to be dressing down, assuming that there are certain assumptions made that if you can do that, then you must be confident enough in your own wealth. So again, you have to get the right context. So, for example, she showed that if you go to university professors and college professors, I should say, those in lesser colleges or not as prestigious, if they're dressing down, they're not regarded as prestigious as, say, those professors who dress up. Whereas the reverse is true if you go to one of the Ivy Leagues. So if they're dressing down, then they're regarded as very cool by the students. So you can see it has to be context specific.
So a Harvard professor can wear jeans and T-shirt, but someone at a state college or community college, you better dress up.
You better dress up. Exactly.
Yeah. So again, that gets to the the nature of your book is called Possessed. I mean, possessions are very subjective, context dependent in terms of their value. Again, back to another personal story. In 1993, one of our corporate sponsors, my marketing firm, got this watch company called Baume Mercier. Now, I never heard of them. I never heard of any of these luxury watches. I didn't even know there was such a thing as a luxury watch market. So, she calls me and says, I got this Baume Mercier. I was like, what is that? It's a watch. Okay. So at the time, I think this watch, and they gave me this watch I was the race director. So I got this watch, this particular one I've had since 1993. It still works. And I think it was $1,500 at the time, which to me at the time sounded just like I might as well buy a Learjet or something. I just had no idea. And then I looked into it, and there was like this whole market of people that collect luxury watches. They even have these boxes that self-rotate. They rotate every couple hours for the self-winding watches, and it's like, oh my God, this is ridiculous. And I was kind of relieved that I couldn't afford any of it. And then I don't know, back maybe in the early 2000s, when I was looking at them again just for fun, and I saw some ripoffs, and I could not tell the difference. These are made in China, all the luxury brands, Rolex and so forth. And to me, it's like, well, what's the point of my owning the real one for a couple $1,000s versus one I could buy for $50 or $100 from the guy on the street with, opens his coat and he's got all the Rolex watches there, and you can't tell the difference.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it again, it gets back to this whole issue of authenticity and and that's why brands are so protective of checking out and trying to get rid of the counterfeits, because if their brand is compromised by a market of counterfeits, then, as you say, it completely undermines the whole point of having them in the first place. But ultimately, the value is partly psychological. If they're working as efficiently, then it shouldn't really matter. I mean, I would say that luxury brands generally are better made, and they generally last longer than the knockoffs. But it's not simply that. It's not simply the quality. There's something about the message that's being sent out as well.
Yeah. I guess also if you're on the top, you have to be careful not to be envied and resented. Well,
there are two types of envy, isn't there? I mean, there's malicious envy, where you really kind of resent somebody. And then there's benign envy, where you want to emulate somebody. So what advertisers try to do, and what branding and luxury producers want to do, is they want to stimulate this kind of benign envy where you aspire to own that watch or you aspire to have the Oakley glasses. What they don't want is the kind of malicious envy where kind of people want to kind of pull it down and, you know, try and level the playing field, as it were. So there are different types of envy that work in different ways.
Kind of a resentment of you having more stuff. Yeah, I guess, again, that's sort of context dependent. My friend Bill Nye, the science guy, he used to come over to my house back in the 90s and early 2000s in these various electric cars, which are these little boxy, nerdy looking things. They'd only go like 50 miles, and he'd get to my house and he'd plug in, so he could get a few extra miles so he could make it home. And I always thought that was super cool, that he was like an early adopter, a cutting edge, and so on. And then in 2015, I bought a Tesla. And, I could barely afford it, and I wanted to support the team. I love Elon Musk, and I needed I just wanted to have an electric car to see what it was like. And so I did it. And I go, Bill, I got an electric car. You got to get a Tesla. And he's like, no, I cannot be seen in that kind of electric car. And in a way is because he, he has a lot more money than I have because he's very successful. But for him, it wasn't the money. It was like, I'm an everyman guy. And he is. He's a really good guy. But now I think it's got to be different, because when I got my first Tesla in 2015, I did get some sort of weird looks, and I kind of tried to play it down. I quit mentioning it. And now in 2019, I don't know about in England, but in California, they're all over the place. It's like, it's no big deal to have a Tesla anymore. And in a way, I'm kind of relieved. It's like, okay, good. Yeah. Because I didn't want people looking at me like, oh, who does he think he is? Yeah. I have it. I don't have it for status. I have it because it's fun to drive. Yeah. And on California freeways with the self-driving device, you can just get in the left lane and it steers for you and the whole thing. And it's just
when I first arrived and got my kind of tenured position, I bought myself a Porsche, and I had to get rid of it 3 months later. I couldn't handle the shame of driving around in it. I mean, it was a great car to drive, but the society wasn't right to be seeing that. And by the way, coincidentally, I've just bought my first electric car today.
You did?
So,
oh my God.
I did. Yeah, I got a Mitsubishi, well, I just feel that, things are changing. We got to, if you can afford to do it, then we should try and,
absolutely.
At least that'll encourage the market, and eventually the prices should come down so that everyone can kind of participate in it.
That's right. Even if Tesla goes out of business, which it still could, the effect is done now. Everyone's got bringing out electric cars, and they're all going to go 300, 400 miles on a charge. Yeah. And they're going to be $35,000 like any other regular car. And, it's already happening.
So this is a really I think this is quite an important point. I read that review you did, Robert Frank's book, and I thought you made some really valuable points about trying to change people's behavior with a top-down totalitarian approach to things. And I actually agree with you. I think there are some things which definitely you do need to regulate. For example, we both agree on vaccinations, and that's something that's not up for argument.
Right.
But I can see that there's more power in the grassroots, bottom-up benevolence, if you want to call it, this kind of awakening in people that, for example, we had this, and I'm sure you guys are going to get this very shortly. Last year, David Attenborough did a thing called Blue Planet 2, and he had a sequence of the plastics in the ocean. And this has caused this huge movement. To the extent now that, other companies, the biggest conglomerate of plastic producers just announced they're going to put $2.6 billion into removing these plastics. So in other words, you can get changes, you can get businesses responding to movements if you educate people about the benefits of doing that, rather than trying to legislate that. So I agree with you about that. I think that if we can recognize that some aspects of ownership are definitely a little bit illogical, then that would be a way to do it, rather than trying to tax things out of existence. But it's part of our makeup. I mean, we believe that you should be rewarded for efforts, and part of that is the benefits of ownership. But it's when that ownership becomes so distorted that it creates the sorts of problems that I allude to in the book. So I actually think that in the case of the Teslas and the electric cars, people who kind of get into the idea of the technology behind it and the way that if eventually the cost can be brought down, then this will have these benefits in the long term. So that's what I think, and we're seeing already. So yes, we're in trouble with the climate, but I think that if you just change behaviors from a bottom-up way through education rather than legislation, then you're probably going to get more long-term adaptations.
I'm predicting by 2040, maybe there'll be no more internal combustion engine cars. They'll all be electric everywhere. And then if you want to drive one, you go to a racetrack, and you pay a little fee, and it's like going to the circus or whatever. You're going to go drive one of these gas guzzling loud cars. Yeah. And then I was thinking my 3-year-old, by the time he's 15, 16 years old, he may never drive. I mean, it could be that self-driving cars and Ubers and ride sharing and all that is the new industry. And there's no reason to drive. And then it'll be a hobby. Like, I'm going to go to the racetrack and learn how to drive.
Yeah. That's true. Yeah.
So it could be the entire history of the internal combustion engine from the horseless carriage in, say, 1890s to, say, 2050. That could be it. There could be no more.
Well, it's like hunting. We had to hunt in the past in order to get our food, and now it's a recreational sport.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, right.
So it's with time, technology. I mean, things move forward. I don't think we should be complacent. So I think it's always worth holding up a mirror to society and pointing out things. But I don't believe in the declinism that we see. That is, everything's going to hell in a basket, because I think that creates the right atmosphere for extremism and populism and this kind of fear mentality, which we're seeing now in both the US and actually in Europe in general as well. So it'll be interesting to see how all that plays out. But the consequences of that kind of attitude is a refusal to participate in activities which we need to do at a global level. So climate change is not going to be solved by one nation; it has to be solved internationally. And when you get this kind of refusal to play a game, this is when we have this problem with the tragedy of the commons, where everyone thinks that they can do their own thing. But if everyone did do that, then ultimately we'd be screwed. So I think that the trouble with this kind of fear of the future is it stokes the fires of extremism, and that's unfortunate. And that's what we kind of need to kind of be a bit more optimistic about, but not complacent.
Yeah, well, I was reading your book. Another thing I was thinking about in terms of protecting the environment and so on, top down versus bottom up. Yeah, there's these arguments that having a private owner of a piece of land that has rhinos on it or tiger, lions or whatever, and he owns that land, he owns the animals on it, and then he basically charges hunters to come in and shoot one. You get one, something like that. And so he's motivated to take care of the animals, take care of the environment, and keep it sustained. And yet we go ballistic when, these cases of some rich doctor comes back and he shot a lion. This lion has a name, it's 15 years old. It has, children and so on. It's like, oh my God, how could he do this? And the counter argument is that, well, if this guy didn't own that land and sold those licenses, poachers would do it if it was just a government piece of land. Yeah,
and indeed, that's actually that's the financial model that a lot of the countries in South Africa are operating with. Exactly, the reserves are there. If you think about it, that's what tourism is all about. Right. And actually, for anyone who thinks that tourism is somehow lower costs on the environment than materialism, I would point actually, if you think about what we're doing when we're traveling around the world and staying in hotels, think about all the things which are thrown away because that's what we expect with our luxury. So I mean we're all impacting. We all have carbon footprints, and just because you don't necessarily buy a gas guzzling car doesn't mean that you're not having any impact if you're just living this experiential life, never having to accumulate anything. That in itself will come at a cost. So
you had that number of bars of soap in hotel rooms that are thrown out. It's like 1 billion or something. It's phenomenal.
Like 1 billion.
It's crazy.
Well, you think about it.
I know. Well, I was just thinking about that. I almost never unwrap those because I know I'm going to use it once or twice, and then most of the bar, 99% of the bar is still there and it gets thrown away. I just take the shampoo bottle that I'm going to use, and I just use that to wash my hands.
I take them home and I don't buy shampoo.
You do? Okay, there you go.
So everyone thinks they come and stay at my place. They think they're getting a kind of luxury experience.
Yeah. So let's talk about income inequality. That's a big issue now, the last 5 years or so. there's an intuitive sense that we have about too much. The person's making too much. And it's like if the CEO makes 10 times what the average worker makes, that doesn't feel so bad. But when it's 200 times more, or 1,000 times more than the average worker.
Yeah.
So the question is, where's the line psychologically where we think, yeah, that's okay? And also, is it context dependent on what the person's doing? So, for example, one of my best friends, Michael Coles, he made his millions selling chocolate chip cookies. He was the founder and owner of the Great American Cookie Company. And he's a super good guy. He lives in Atlanta, and he's very generous with his money and so on. And he's a nice guy. But there's a sense like, it seems okay that he made tens of millions of dollars because he made cookies. And everybody likes chocolate chip cookies. But the guy on Wall Street, he's just moving binary digits around on a screen. Yeah. And maybe he doesn't make 10, maybe he makes $100 million. Somehow that doesn't feel right.
No, it doesn't, does it? I mean, the studies suggest that actually everyone is quite happy for there not to be a kind of communist situation. Most of us recognize that meritocracy and effort should be valued. The problem is that we're really poor at actually objectively, assessing the imbalances. So most Americans would be happy with the top 20% owning maybe 40 to 50%. But as you're well aware, that currently the average CEO earns 350 times the salary of the lowest workers. So the imbalances are quite extraordinary. 1% owns over 50% of the world's wealth. So I think that is something which rankles with most people. And especially, as you say, there's no tangible output from them. There's no benefit to mankind. That's effectively what they're paid gamblers. And gambling is something which I don't think you can make a lot of money doing it, but it doesn't really better society, which is kind of ironic because I just tweeted something only 2 days ago. We've got a thing called the National Lottery in the UK, and it's now promoting gambling, the lottery, with this promise that your life could change all for the better. And they know full well that first of all doesn't necessarily happen because people who earn large amounts, who get large payouts, are not necessarily happier. There's a lot of work to suggest that doesn't always follow. But obviously, only a small set of people can ever have those benefits. So I guess when you're looking at inequality and you're trying to judge whether or not people deserve that, I think intuitively you do look for something which is a net profit to society at large. And even those individuals, the club of the billionaires are giving all their wealth away. I think that, that's wonderful. Warren Buffett and Bill Gates and that lot, and they're doing that because I think they recognize that if you remove or if you provide your children with such wealth, then you're taking away their opportunity to feel, the joy of achievement. And that taking away that motivation, I think, is really, a sad thing that we do. But as parents, of course, we're kind of wired through our genes to try and ensure that our offspring are successful and pass them on and on. So there's a conflict of interest between what we'd like to do biologically and psychologically what we should be doing for them, which is in their best interests. So getting back to your point, I suppose there will always be inequality. I think it's just the nature of competition. And indeed, you could argue that inequality, that meritocracy, is a spur. It actually stimulates innovation. It stimulates entrepreneurship. This is the kind of capitalist notion, and I think that's probably true. But it's when it becomes so extreme that it creates societies which are so fractionated that you don't want to go into certain parts of the city because you basically become these gated communities. Mm-hmm. That when you get to that sort of situation, then you're not really living a human life. You're living a kind of, you're a cage in a cage. So right. I think that. I think that I don't know what the number is. I don't know what the figure is. But yeah, it can't be where we're going at the moment. The relentless pursuit of wealth, I think, is something that we have to question. But again, it gets back to this point. Well, what drives these people on? Well, it's because there's always someone ahead of them. Right. And they kind of catch up with them and they want to be top dog. And so these are the motivations which are driving us all the time. I don't think it's the wealth per se. Once you've got your basic level of living, the work of Danny Kahneman and all these people. Right. It's not a large amount. But there's always someone with you more, and so you keep aspiring to have more and more, and that will ultimately be kind of unfulfilling, I think. I mean, it's great to have nice luxury products, and it's great to do that, but you're not necessarily going to be all that more happier with it. And arguably, you could say that, as I said, there's a great cartoon, and I don't know who drew it, but it's a man lying on his deathbed. And he says, is his last dying where he says, "I wish I bought more crap." And, and I think that's something that we should bear in mind, that we buy a lot of things we don't really need. And that's because we're suckers for advertising, we're suckers for marketing, and we want to be accepted. And I think social media has definitely demonstrated the vulnerability and insecurities of most of us, that we want to be kind of recognized and acknowledged. And part of the way that we do that is through, accumulating wealth and all those possessions. But as I point out, that there's deep biological mechanisms for why that is what pursues us. The pursuit of the next new thing.
Yeah.
Brian Knutson's work, the neuroscientist out in California, has shown that it's actually the chase, which is the thrilling thing. It's the potential where before you've bought the car, before you got the watch, whatever, that's what really is the stimulating. Once you've got it, that drops off very, very quickly. So it's kind of this relentless kind of chasing this status thing, which is driving us forward.
That reminded me of Woody Allen's funny line about, he holds up his wrist with his watch. He says, "My grandfather on his deathbed sold me his watch." Which gets us into wills. You have data on wills and trusts, and that we tend to give people that are genetically related to us stuff from our when we're going to die and so on. Even though maybe we don't get along with them anymore, or we don't even have relationships with them anymore. You'd think we would give them to our best friends or good charities or something like that, but the data shows otherwise.
No, that's true, and it follows kin selection predictions. So the more genetically related are, the more likelihood you are to get. But there are some peculiar patterns. I discovered one which I hadn't really ever thought about, and I was really surprised. And that is the pattern of altruism in grandparents. So if you imagine the grandparents, and then they've got the parents of the wife and the husband, and then there's the grandchild. It turns out that the most generous grandparent is the maternal grandmother. Okay, and you might say, well, why is that the case? Well, if you think about it, the grandchild is a product of the father and the wife, but of course the wife could have been cheating on the husband, so he may not be the father of the child. Right. Therefore, that then excludes the paternal grandparents, because their genetic offspring cannot be guaranteed. Then you might say, okay, so now you've got the maternal grandparents, you've got old Granny Smith and old Granny and Granddad Smith. But it turns out maybe Granny Smith was playing around, and maybe Granddad Smith is not the father of the daughter. So the only one who can be absolutely guaranteed that their genes are propagating is the maternal grandmother. And that's why they're the most generous of the grandparents.
Very interesting. Okay. Yes. All subconscious, obviously, but nature.
Of course, they're not aware yet. Yeah. Right. And there's going to be some exceptions. And what's interesting now, there's been some other analysis looking at step grandparents and step, because nuclear family is a bit of a rarity these days. So you now got all these variations in between.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about, let's see, a couple of hot button issues here, because a lot of what you are dealing with here is very political and social economic. There's a big debate now about reparations for African Americans because of the slave trade. Obviously, we now recognize you can't own somebody else, although you do have a discussion for most of human history. The concept of owning another person was a viable one.
Yeah, perfectly acceptable. Yeah. And most cultures have that. Yeah. So, yes, I mean, the trouble is, again, how far back do you keep going? Because, I mean, it's not just people, but, take, for example, the Elgin marbles, or, the things that we've taken from the lands. You can keep going on. Ultimately, that you can get this almost infinite regress of, well, who was the previous owner, or who was the previous people, and so on. So it does become very difficult. And, in the case of slavery, I mean, clearly there is this legacy of an imbalance. But I think that, I'm not qualified to talk about this sort of thing, to be honest. And I don't live in a society which is as fractionated as the American society. We obviously have Bristol, by the way, was one of the major slaving ports of of the UK. But yeah, I mean, it's true. Individuals of color occupy, in general, the lower echelons of the social strata. And, to what extent can you change that? It's really hard. And I don't think there's any simple sort of equation that, giving back some proportion of wealth as a block sum would be the correct solution. I mean, ultimately, you would hopefully stimulate a society which provides the opportunities for everyone to elevate themselves or better themselves. I mean, simply handing it out, I don't think is well, I haven't given a lot of thought, but I can't imagine that being a kind of justification, or I don't think people would feel that was the right solution. But again, I don't really.
Yesterday there was an op-ed in the LA Times of somebody making an analogy with Germany paying reparations to the Jews and to Israel for the Holocaust. But then, of course, the counter to that, well, these are people still alive. With reparation for slavery, no one's alive. This was centuries ago. And, again, it's hard to draw the line where it's a little more obvious which tangible property the Nazis confiscated. Like there's often examples in the news of pieces of artwork that was stolen. And here it really gets messy. So you have multiple people in the line of ownership. Art galleries bought it, and then they sold it to some other art gallery who sold it to some private owner. And now the original owner family comes knocking. That was our grandfather's artwork, and he was killed in Auschwitz, and we want it back. Well, now the chain of ownership, and somebody, a lot of times these things were, paid millions of dollars for these works of art. Really tough to solve that.
Yeah, well, again, this comes back to what we said at the beginning of the conversation. That's what the lawyers are there for, to establish the precedents and the weight of evidence, or the weight. I mean, there's never a clear demarcation. It's really who has the stronger case. So, and again, that's taking into consideration the a priori positions, but also the subsequent consequences of these actions. So it's not like there's any kind of simple equation where you say, well, there you go, that's what you should be getting, and therefore we can draw a line under it. Because the consequences of the activities of ancestors from 200-300 years ago are playing out in modern times. So it does seem an odd kind of way to try and account for a situation of 300 years ago where that was considered acceptable. You see what I'm saying? I'm not condoning it. I'm just saying it was a different era.
It's a difficult issue there, because once you go down the road, say, of reparations for African Americans, what about Native Americans? I mean, we took all of their land. There's a great line in I think it was Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, History of the United States through the eyes of Native Americans. When Napoleon sold Louisiana to the U.S. government, basically Jefferson was president at the time. I mean, Louisiana was like 1/3 of the entire North American continent. It wasn't his to sell. I mean, he had never even been there. It's just because centuries before the French planted a flag and said, "This is ours."
Well, that's right. So, planting the flag's kind of interesting. I believe the Russians have planted a flag underneath the
North Pole.
The North Pole. They go on the base of the seabed, and of course, now that we are actually developing intergalactic travel, this now sets up. There are accepted international treaties about who can claim ownership over foreign bodies and planets and stars and so on. So again, we're going to get right back to the situation of 600 years ago when the first explorers settled out and took over stuff. What happens if we encounter another race? What are we going to do? We're going to say we're going to claim it from the world, or so. So there is a real difficult issue of trying to resolve these issues.
I've been writing this article on colonizing Mars. So once we get there, who owns that colony? Or worse, in terms of tyranny and freedom, who owns the air that's generated? There's no air there. There's no water there. It has to be produced. So once you have somebody producing the air, what if they get a monopoly on the production of air and water? It's not like in Europe, you can just go to North America and start a new colony because there's free air and free water. There's nothing in Mars.
Yeah, and you've raised a really interesting point, which is the ownership of intellectual property. Again, that case of a couple of years ago, I can't remember what his name was, but he's a real scoundrel. He bought the patent for a drug, and he hiked the price up into ridiculous amounts. And so this legally he was entitled to do it, but morally, so we do constantly have to calibrate our assumptions about ownership and what's fair. And that's kind of interesting. This is actually something in the work on the developmental psychology, that children appreciate fairness. So they understand that things can be unequal, but they also think that things should be fair. And it's establishing what is appropriate and fair and balanced is I suppose what the whole endeavor is trying to do.
Yeah, there are patent trolls, these guys that are super rich and they buy up every last patent they could think of. This is mostly in Silicon Valley, dealing with software stuff. And then they just sit on them. They don't do anything with them, just hoping somebody wants to buy the patent from them.
Yeah, well, that was the .com thing, of course. So you remember everyone buying up every domain name possible. They were calling it the picks and shovels of the .com boom. It was the same way as they bought they bought the picks and shovels during the gold rush. So it is, people are exploitive that way.
Let's talk about jealousy, ownership of spouses. The recent concept of equality in marriages is pretty new. It's really not that long ago, 1950s, I guess, that women couldn't get a loan without the husband's signature on it and so on. It's just stunning how long, it's not quite slavery, but that women were treated as pretty much property of men.
That's right, yeah. In fact, Margaret Thatcher was the first female prime minister. She came to power in 1979, and at that time, she wouldn't have been able to take out a mortgage in her own name. So it's fairly recent. The whole history of relationships was really mostly to do with transference of power and resources. So marriages were ways of consolidating the legal transfers of things. Love is a really recent kind of idea. Yes, it was great if they worked out and liked each other. But most marriages of wealthy people were done to consolidate wealth and make sure the transference of wealth passed down the family lines, which is one of the reasons, the church was kind of, because they didn't want their priests marrying, obviously, because they wanted to keep it within.
Right.
And that led to all sorts of shenanigans.
That's right. Primogeniture was about the church controlling the transfer of land, right?
That's right. Yeah. So for a long period in history, the ownership of property was really at the male. I mean, males and females were considered an item, but basically the wife was the property of the husband, and that was up to about the 19th century, and that's when the divorce started to appear. Prior to that, getting a divorce was almost unheard of, and now, of course, it's almost 50% in the UK now are getting divorced. But even then, that becomes an issue of property, doesn't it? Because they're fighting over who owns what, and so it comes apart as this kind of division of resources again. So people think they own other people, and in some cultures that's still true, and that's why you get these tragedies of you get these what are they called again? I'm blanking here, but in some cultures, you get family annihilations. So actually, you get it in Western culture as well. That's where an estranged father will come and take the kids and they'll kill them, or because it's his property. Right. They want to take back what they feel has been taken away from them. So again, it's a tragic reflection of the way that people think they own people and resources. And when marriages fall apart, you occasionally get this terrible retribution. And it happens in all sorts of property. It happens with people selling houses or having their houses repossessed. They'd rather destroy it rather than another person having it. Again, this speaks to this concept I talk about throughout the book called the extended self. But our identity and who we are is everything that we can claim ownership over. And that includes spouses, that includes homes, that includes property, as well as our bodies and our minds. So we consider ourselves as an extension into the material world.
It's something like 90% of kidnappings are by the estranged spouse in a custody battle.
Yeah, exactly, because they consider it property. They're just reclaiming their property.
Right. Yeah. And you mentioned jealousy as a form of possession. It made me think of David Buss's book on jealousy. He describes it from an evolutionary psych perspective as mate guarding. It's not that I own her. It's that I want to assure that my genes are being propagated and not some other guy's genes. So you become possessive of the female to assure it's your genes. I hadn't really thought of it as a form of possession. I just thought of it as mate guarding. But I guess mate guarding is a kind of what is it you're guarding? It's a possession. That's my mate.
Yeah. Well, I do make a point that only humans really have truly a concept of ownership. Ownership and possession are different things in my mind. Animals possess, and they will fight and compete over mates and land and food and territories and whatever. But ownership differs because ownership is a convention where you both mutually accept that one person in perpetuity owns something, it's their property, and so they can go away and fight a battle, but if they come back, they can take ownership again. There's very little evidence that animals do that. I mean, if you're not actually physically controlling the property, if you leave it and abandon it, the next animal can come along and take it. So there's not that sort of third party policing that you see. That's evident in children from 3, 4 years of age. They understand that once you have something, then someone else can't come and take it. So that's why ownership depends on a certain reciprocity, an assumption or a convention that I'll scratch your back and you'll scratch mine. And that's why I think it is somewhat different. And of course, that once you are freed up from your property, that means you don't have to be there guarding it all the time. So that enables you to then do all sorts of things. It also allows you to transfer that wealth and resources to others. And hence, that's what we were talking about, inheritance and sharing of resources. Whereas possession is a kind of here and now thing. Many animals demonstrate possessive tendencies. So, for example, there's the first possession rule. So, an animal who takes possession of a territory first, most animals won't come and challenge them for that necessarily because they've got this first priority rule. So that avoids a lot of the conflicts, and that's something that you actually find throughout the animal kingdom, from insects all the way up to mammals and primates. But ownership, as I said, is this understanding that you may not be there present at the time, but once ownership has been established, you can then go off and do other stuff.
Yeah.
And that enables you to frees you up for all manner of things that animals generally don't do.
Yeah. And again, back to the marriage problem and why divorce is so nasty, because it's, let's say the guy develops a career for decades while the wife is at home raising the kids and being a home here. I'm just thinking like, say 1950 and before. And then they get divorced, and then she's entitled to half his income, for the rest of her life and so forth, based on the unpaid work, the labor that society recognizes as valuable, but doesn't put a price on. So I could see both sides of that. Guys are very resentful. Why should I have to pay her? I'm the one who did this work and developed this. I went to medical school or whatever while she was home. But from her perspective, I was doing all this unpaid labor. So where's my, value?
Yeah, and also I was thwarted from pursuing my own career, and I had to give that up in order to maintain the household, in order to be there for you. And when you have people working in two sorts of jobs, this creates all sorts of tension. So, there's a lot of conflict of interests in personal relationships, and that's, partly historical.
Then you get these extreme cases like now Jeff Bezos' wife is one of the richest people on the planet. Same thing with Steve Jobs' a widow. She's now one of the richest people in the world. And when Sam Walton died, I think his offspring, his kids, his issue, as the lawyers call it, they are now like 6 of the 10 richest people on the planet, and they did nothing. In this case, so on the extreme ends, it feels kind of crazy, but you can see the logic behind why the law has to be structured that way.
Yeah, no, I agree.
For transfer of property. So you also talk about xenophobia, the fear of loss of ownership. I put a question mark there, So what is it that people are afraid of with immigrants, say, or people in other countries?
So that's when you look at the rhetoric and the language it's used. It's basically taking back control and the fear of others coming in and taking over your property, taking your jobs, taking your lands. And I think it just is a natural language to describe that fear of loss. And there was a really interesting analysis done by Ronald Inglehart, who is a political scientist, and he looked at the distribution of voters for the populist countries, populist candidates. And he noted there were 2 types. One group was a demographic who were basically felt that they had been ostracized, or they had no control anymore. So these were the lower unemployed social working classes. But the other group, and this is true of Trump, it's also true of, I believe, also the UK and certainly of some of the European populist politicians. The other group is the sort of middle-class, middle-aged white males. And for them, the argument, he calls this the silent revolution. For them, it's the resentment of what they perceive as a loss of their values. As increased liberalism has eroded their kind of worldview, and so they see this as a moral decline, and so they want to have this authoritarian figures who are resolute and powerful and strong to reinstate what they believe is the right order. So it's kind of interesting. It isn't just those who have been excluded from society at the lowest echelons. It's those who also feel that their society is changing far too fast. Jonathan Haidt has done the same analysis and shown that this is true. And it's kind of interesting. You've got individuals like Jordan Peterson's, and we're suddenly seeing all this kind of reaction against liberalism, which I think is just another symptom of this kind of anxiety that everything's going to hell in a basket.
Yeah. So, the conservative is concerned about these moral values that held the tribe together.
Yeah.
In a time, just sort of try to take their perspective. In a time when we lived in a dangerous world where, there is a world with walls, and on those walls are men with guns, the line from A Few Good Men that I love, that, in our tribal past, it did pay to be sort of paranoidly cautious about people from other tribes because they really were dangerous. Jared Diamond makes this point. He has a funny story about going out birding in Papua New Guinea with his, native guides, and they come across this total stranger, and Jared's like, "Hey, let's go say hi," and the guy's like, "No, we have no idea who this guy is. Are you insane?" So he calls this constructive paranoia, that we should be cautious. Our evolutionary psychology is that we should be cautious and risk averse because the world is very dangerous. The second law of thermodynamics and entropy, there's so many more ways for things to go bad than good. That the purpose of life is to sort of carve out a little niche of order and security in a sea of chaos. This is Jordan Peterson's whole point, his whole thing about order and chaos. The world is pretty chaotic and dangerous. Now, to modern ears, it's like, are you kidding me? We have this great society and it's super safe, and there's plenty of wealth to go around. It's great. But that's not the world we evolved in. We evolved in this world. So I sometimes see the conservative worldview and values as having arisen from this dangerous world where they are very cautious about immigrants. So that becomes a proxy for these political issues like like Trump. Immigrants are coming here. The Mexicans are coming here to take our jobs, to take our children and our wives. And so, he played that up to the hilt, and people bought that.
Well, it tapped into a deep anxiety, and this is something that we have from a very early age, and I think it must be deep in our psyche as a species that, yes, we are competitive, and therefore, if someone tells you this is something to be concerned about, then it's no surprise, really, that people react in the way they did. I think the problem is that if you start to change your society to such an extent that you become such a kind of reactive, kind of cautious, I think it will impede. I mean, we basically know there's a lot of value from variation. There's a lot of value from immigrants. I mean, there's a lot of expertise. There's a lot to be gained from that. But ultimately, I come down to the basic point is that, we're on a planet of limited size, limited resources, and we ain't going anywhere fast. Okay, so
we're not sending everybody to Mars just yet.
No. And the notion of going further than that, as far as I'm aware, you can't shrink time just yet. So that means that it will be our children's children who might just make it to the new world. And so I'm not going to get on that ship. So I don't know about you, but so this is going to be this is where we are for the present moment in time, and we have a situation where this tribalism is threatening the coherence in the same way that the tragedy of the commons point I make in the book, that if we don't all kind of work together and figure it out, we are actually going to accelerate some of the problems that we've created. And that's why you can't be so restrictionist. You have to be open to the possibility, well, not the possibility, the inevitability that we've got to get along. Or you just have a major war and, have a meltdown. And that's where you clear out half the population. But I'm not sure that's what we want to do. And of course, we've got other natural selection processes coming on. We're well due a pandemic. Everyone in the know tells us that this is going to be another conflict, another situation that no single nation will be able to address by themselves because of the nature of the way that we are traveling, the way that we are communicating, the way that we are so integrated. So I don't think it really is a wise policy to try and build the walls, shut the doors and just assume that everything's going to be absolutely fine. And also, you need to trade. So, ultimately, you can't just kind of...
That's right. I think, Trump's economic nationalism is very primitive, old school, pre-Adam Smith, really.
Yeah,
the form of mercantilism. It's a zero-sum game. And, if China has more than us, then that means we have that much less. And, it's just not how the modern economies work. But it's counterintuitive to sort of grind through the economic theory to understand that. It just seems easier if I have more gold and that guy has less gold, and that's good for our team.
Yeah. But of course, it's the amount of gold on the planet which makes a difference. It's a relative power. And that's, unfortunately, people don't think in those large scale issues because we just generally don't think in population statistics. We think in my neighbor, my colleagues. Our kind of statistical mindset is not Bayesian. It's really kind of limited to kind of one-to-one comparisons. But actually, you need to have a kind of... I'm not going to explain, but Bayes. I mean, you have to know what the kind of distributions are in order to get a sense of where you are in the pecking order.
Yeah. I think of money as something different than other possessions. It's a tool to get more stuff, but not just stuff. Free time, autonomy, freedom. I remember I mentioned my buddy Michael Coles, the chocolate chip cookie guy. I met him back in the 80s when I was a poor bicycle racer, and he had just started making a lot of money, and I was going, I was saying, boy, you got a great life. And he goes, oh, Shermer, it's not that simple. I mean, when you have this much money, you have to invest it in different instruments. You got different accounts. You have to pay attention. It's almost a full-time job managing the money. And I thought, man, I wish I had that problem. So in a way, it opens up a lot of opportunities and doors. And either way, if you're poor, you're hoping you have enough just to make your bills at the end of the month. And if you're rich, maybe you worry about, you have a mortgage that's, too high for the amount that you make. It's all kind of relative. But I'd rather have the one problem than the other problem.
That's where being West, I've been rich and I've been poor. Believe me, being rich is better. Or Tyler Durden in Fight Club. The things that you own end up owning you. So you're right. I mean, the more that you accumulate, the more. I mean, I was just thinking about this just recently. The number of warranties, the number of things I have to get double checked, all the kind of legislation around property is a real pain in the ass.
Yeah.
The more you have, the more your kind of time is taken up just kind of keeping control of it. And I agree. I think that, that's what wealth really does. It gives you the luxury of time. And that's the one thing that none of us has an unlimited amount of. That's one thing that we're all going to lose in the end. And so it's how you spend that time. But for some people, I just come back to it. They lost the plot in many ways. For them, that time should be in the pursuit of wealth. So that's why I think they flipped it in the wrong way around, because yes, once you get past that basic level, you really then have to think about yourself as a clock or a sand timer tipping down. The grains are draining away, and we're all going to end up at the same place.
You can't take it with you.
You can't take it with you, and you don't want to say, as I said earlier, you don't want to say, "I wish I bought more crap." In the same way as I wish I got that bonus, or I wish I'd, and that's actually awkward and difficult for people because most of us are on autopilot, and we can see the immediate goals as being what we're pursuing, and that gives us a sense of moving forward and success. But actually, when you look at the big picture of those goals, you realize, oh, hold a second, this is a short-term thing, and actually the long-term thing is, I'm not saying there's any purpose to life. There's no deep wisdom I have here, and I'm sure many people have thought about these things at point, but it's all too often to get caught up in the immediate problem solving of our daily lives, fixing the car, getting the radiator sorted, getting all this, because these are tangible things that have got finite time, but we don't think about our demise or our ultimate departure.
Right.
And so it's much easier to live on these short-term goals because it seems to be progress.
My friend Deepak Chopra is always telling people to live in the now. And like Eckhart Tolle's book, The Power of Now, that the past has already happened. You can't do anything about it. The future hasn't happened yet. You can only control right now. And so just live in the now. And I remember, I think I said to Deepak, but Deepak, my mortgage is due next week. I gotta work. I gotta do something, you know.
He's wealthy enough that he can.
But there's some, I think what you're after there, and you discuss in your book, is finding some balance. It's good to have some money and some possessions. It's totally normal. But if you're too obsessed with it, or you go overboard, or you're on the hedonic treadmill, you're never going to catch up. And that has consequences not only socially and environmentally, but personally. Yes. It takes a toll. So there's something about finding not happiness. This has always bothered me about the happiness research and the claim that, you know, after $75,000 a year or so, happiness levels don't go up. That's debatable, but I think it's the wrong metric. It's like life satisfaction or leading a meaningful life or a purposeful life. Yeah. And the thing that money gets you is more opportunities to find those kinds of things that give you meaning and purpose. You know, maybe I know Bill Gates, he spends, his full-time job now is giving his money away, and he can't give it away fast enough. He has so much, he makes so much. It's like, I wish I had that problem. And I can see it's stressful and so on. He wants to do the right thing, and effective altruism is a great movement, kind of a rational way to give out the money that will help the most people. And that's a hard job. But it's like that kind of opportunity never existed in the past, only in the last century and a half or so that people were rich enough to be able to do that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And the way you were describing happiness is actually Aristotle. He was very dismissive of the kind of concept of gratification. And that's what people think, pleasure, sweet chocolates and delicious wines and fast cars. He would be very dismissive of that and say that was vulgar. Yeah, that's something that any animal can do. Right. Humans should aspire to the moral higher ground. They should seek purpose. They should enrich the lives of fellow man. And for him, then the pleasure you get from that is not the primary goal. It's derived because you've engaged in life. And I agree with you. And I think that money does give you that freedom to do so. But yeah, I can't. It's all about balance. It's all about how you divide up your time and, whether you're kind to other people. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with being wealthy per se, but if that comes at the consequence of other people around you, then clearly that becomes a moral issue, does it not? And I think that's something that no one could easily defend, although often you hear, screw the suckers. But I do think we have a moral obligation to help those who can't help themselves. The gray areas in what constitutes can't help themselves, because here you get into the role of luck and contingency in how lives turn out. I wrote a Quillette article on this, in which I started off with Obama's famous line about if you have a successful company, you didn't build that. Well, now of course he didn't mean you didn't do anything. But you transport your goods on public roads. That your employees are all educated at public schools. The society does a lot. The government does a lot. The government developed the internet, for example. So the billionaires should thank the government through taxes and this sort of. I definitely see that there's a good argument there. Conservatives' heads explode when they hear this, because they have this just world theory that if you're poor, it's because you didn't work hard enough, or you're lazy, or you're not creative. But in fact, for example, we know from behavior genetics that half of temperament of the big five personality is genetic. So if you get up in the morning and you feel full of vim and vigor and you want to go out and make money and buy stuff and so on, well, you didn't really completely choose to do that. A lot of people are born, they don't want to rush out and work 20-hour days and so on. They want to just kind of take it easy or whatever. That's kind of a temperament. And I can't say that one is better than the other. I mean, it could be if you want to work 20 hours a week rather than 40 or 60 or 80 hours a week, that could be a better life. I remember when I started college, I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do, doctors, lawyers, business owners, entrepreneur, and so on. The thing I saw first was college professors. These guys have a great life. They get summers off and Christmas off and Easter off, and they can travel and they have short weeks and they can control their time. I thought, this is the job I want. I want to be a college professor. And it's not that they don't work as hard as, say, doctors and lawyers. It's that they have much more freedom of time structure, control of their lives. That appealed to me. Yeah, well, I concur, obviously, because this is what I've
Yeah,
been
that's
doing.
what you do. Yeah.
Although I have to say, I wasn't that astute, I wasn't that worldly aware at the time. I just wanted to do something that I felt passionate about, and for me, it was psychology, and so then I discovered actually I can have a really great time just thinking about talking to smart people, and that's what I really value. So I feel I have the best job in the world. I don't need to earn a vast amount of money doing that. But I just want to come back to your point about luck. I think it's really, we don't, we underestimate, we look at very successful people and we think, well, what have they got? How do they do? A lot of it is luck.
Yeah.
9 out of 10 businesses we know fail within the first year. There's always just, the odd, I mean, most successful people will admit well, very often they'll have tried it more than once. So they do have resilience. So I think there's something to be said for someone who keeps going until they get that lucky break. But yeah, it's nothing you can necessarily control. And so we shouldn't be dismissive of people who have fallen on hard times or luck has just not worked out for them. Rather, we should try to kind of create a system which allows for that variance without kind of idolizing the celebrity status of people who have been successful. So yeah, I think things like, I mean, obviously the social media and the ease of communication has rather amplified these sorts of problems. But we're at the beginning of a new technology. We're in one of the major transitions in our civilization. The human species, the digital era will be go down as probably one of the major transitions points. And so we're still finding our way. We're still finding our way around social media. We're still finding our way about inequalities and so on. But I'm an optimist, and I think that ultimately that we probably will kind of get through it all. Although who knows in 30, 40 years time. But
yeah, I'm not sure how good social media is. I use it all the time. I do find my mind drifting, or I should say, noticing things I probably shouldn't be paying attention to. So, for example, when Richard Dawkins posts something on Twitter, I'm giving a speech here at this conference, and instead of thinking, good for Richard Dawkins, that's great, I think, why wasn't I invited to that conference? Or you got to give the Christmas lectures. Hey, how come he got to give the Christmas lecture? I can see how social media definitely generates a lot of negative envy. I think you called it negative envy.
No, I think you're probably right there. But okay, so that's definitely the dark side of the social media. But if you just think about it, well, maybe not the social media, but there are opportunities to connect with people that I mean, I just connected with a whole bunch of people from my school days about a month ago, and actually, I discovered actually they're not who I thought they were, and it just we've got these memories which create these nostalgic views of the world, and sometimes social media can recalibrate you and say, actually, things were not what I remembered. So maybe you're right. Maybe we should just get rid of it.
You have that great quote from Franklin Adams: "Nothing is more responsible for the good old days than a bad memory."
Hey, I stole that from Pinker, so
it's a great quote.
Who owns it? I mean, that's
yeah, right. Yeah. That's right. Who owns these quotes? Well, that's another problem. Quotes migrate up to the most famous person who ever said them. Yeah. So again, big political implications of your concept of possessed. Israel versus Palestine, the Middle East. I mean, this is basically two guys with the same deed for the same piece of property claiming divine ownership.
Yeah, and they're not going to give it up. And if you offer them money for it, you're insulting them. It's like, that's the whole point about sacred values. You cannot place a monetary value on these things. So you're never going to be able to resolve this issue through kind of enforcement or kind of financial things. It's so intractable because the architects did not realize that, when you're talking about identity and lands and homelands, this is something that, you're just creating a nightmare, a perfect storm. And that's why the situation in Palestine and Israel is not going to be solved through that kind of force or monetary positions, because you're tapping into something which is intrinsic to identity. Right.
If you say, well, God gave us this land, that's a non-falsifiable claim. I really have no idea what I don't know if you have a solution to the problem, but I just have no idea. It seems an intractable one.
An alien invasion would be pretty appropriate because, just like Independence Day, we can all come together when we've got an external third alien race to deal with.
Well, really, it's the two-state solution with I guess the lawyers would just have to hack out exactly where the line is and what the
Yeah.
details are, and that just seems really hard.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, I don't think they had any behavioral economists or psychologists around when they were figuring out, to
Right.
create the state of Israel. They just didn't really consider the consequences of it.
The other thing I've been thinking about a lot that came up when I was reading your book, drugs and prostitution. So prostitution, I mean, a woman owns her body. She should be able to do what she
Yeah.
wants. But when you really look at what really goes on, the pimps kind of control these women. They they try to own the women. They use drugs. They start them when they're teenagers, where they're not fully adults to make rational decisions like, this is my body, I can do what I want. In the kind of classical liberal or libertarian sense. They're not thinking like that at all. And
No.
same thing with polygamy. It's like, well, why can't people marry whoever they want or however many spouses they want? Well, if you look at the fundamentalist Mormons, they start these girls off at a very young age. They're brainwashed. They just have no idea what it means to be an independent woman. They're 5 years old and they're told, you're going to marry this guy and he's going to have 10 wives. You're going to have sister wives and all that. So that seems to be one of these areas that there's a lot of gray area in.
Yeah, and we're talking about vulnerable people who are exploited. I don't think anyone. Not. I would imagine very few prostitutes go into it because they really, really enjoy it.
Right.
I think ultimately they may say that, but ultimately I think it's desperation, or they've been trafficked.
Right.
So we're talking about modern slavery.
Right.
In a sense, it's no different. And of course, drugs are, again, we should definitely legalize that, because that would just cut out a whole kind of incentive that again amplifies the problems, because it's taking advantage of people who really just are the worst in society. So. I mean, I'm not sure it's issues of ownership as such, but it does get down to the way that people are exploited, and when they are desperate, then they will do anything, and that's one of the reasons that this is a problem which is not about to go away.
Right. Well, again, the state steps in and says, well, you don't just own your body. We are making the decision collectively that prostitution is bad for society because these are not consenting adults making rational decisions. There's something else going on here. And that's always been the argument with drugs, which I think was a wrong argument. This is bad for society because it leads people to do whatever that's not good for society, like with abolition of alcohol, the prohibition on alcohol. That was a bad experiment. I think the drug thing has to go the same way. I think that's probably a different category, but it's the same line of reasoning. What's good for me may not be good for society, a collective action problem. Sometimes it's solved correctly, sometimes it's not.
Yeah.
So, well, Bruce, we've been going an hour and a half. We've covered a lot of huge topics. What do you want people to? What's the take-home message from this book?
Well, I suppose that I think that we all need to look very carefully at what motivates us in life in terms of our choices, the jobs that we take, the careers we pursue, the things that we buy, the activities we engage in, and I question, why are we doing it? And if it is one to accumulate material wealth or possessions, then we have to recognize what are the motivations for doing so. And yes, if you like cars because they give you a sense of a thrill, that's fine. But if you realize, as I did with my Porsche, the reason I bought it was I was trying to make a statement, and I actually ended up feeling very uncomfortable about it, then we have to recognize the psychological components of ownership, what motivates us. And then maybe not feel so bad about it, because a lot of it is deep in our biology. It can be traced to kind of some earlier mechanisms. Ultimately, we must recognize, again, that the planet is of limited size, limited resources. So we're going to have to do something to curtail this pursuit, because we don't have a choice. So I think once you educate people through reading a book like Possessed, you start to I hope, change perceptions about what it is to own.
Well, I love the book. It was a great read, and I hope it does well. What's next on your research agenda, or where are you going now?
Essentialism. I'm going back into essentialism.
Oh, you
again.
are?
Yeah, I think there's a book there, and I really want to really take that apart and show you how that, again, is. I mean, I love writing books about which lift the hood up if you like, on what's going under the engine, what motivates us to do things. And I think essentialism increasingly, as we see new technologies, gene engineering, and I think we're going to start to butt up against our deep intuitions about what it is to be something. So I'd like to do a book on that.
Ooh, that's good. I love that. Yeah, particularly with the rise of companies like 23andMe and really get in the essence of who you are compared to other people and society and so on. Yeah, that sounds great. That's going to be a great book. The essence of it all, or something like that.
I'll have to get a publisher, but I'll get this one out and enjoy this, and hopefully I'll get over to the US, and hopefully we can. Once you've mastered the pen and the podium,
that's right. You never sleep or dine alone. Dine or sleep alone, Hitch said. That's right. All right, Bruce. Good to see you again. Congratulations on the book. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Michael.
Okay.
Great to hear.
Bye-bye.
Great to see you. Bye.
Bye-bye.